August 14th, 2018, Genoa, Italy, 11:43 a.m. A section of motorway bridge measuring 210 meters tears itself off its foundations and drops 45 meters onto warehouses, railway lines, and residential streets below. 43 people die. Among them, families traveling for the summer holiday, children in back seats, delivery drivers crossing a route they had crossed 1,000 times before. The bridge had been standing for 51 years. The collapse took less than 10 seconds. What nobody notices yet is that 6 years earlier, in 2012, the company managing the bridge produced an internal document predicting exactly this outcome. The report warned of potential structural failure within a decade. It was never made public. The bridge fell in year 6. The explanation does not survive the check. The official story asks you to accept that a major infrastructure company, a government ministry, and a team of professional engineers all missed the warning signs. That sensors, inspections, reports, and maintenance schedules somehow failed to register the danger. That the collapse was a tragedy, an accident, a failure of foresight. But here is what the prosecutors discovered in the criminal investigation. The private company managing the bridge also owned the engineering firm contracted to inspect it. The inspectors were employed by the company they were supposed to regulate. Safety reports for different years were found to be identical copies with only the date changed. Photographs of structural cracks were allegedly edited using image software to make damage disappear from official documents. Monitoring sensors designed to measure dangerous cable vibrations were tampered with or removed. Managers received performance bonuses for keeping operational costs low, which meant avoiding expensive repairs. Directors were warned repeatedly about the risk of collapse, but delayed the work to preserve shareholder dividends. And the designer of the bridge, Riccardo Morandi, had written in 1979, 39 years before the disaster, that this type of structure required constant and expensive maintenance to prevent corrosion. The warning was in writing. The corrosion was measurable. The risk was quantified. The money was available. The bridge collapsed anyway. How did a private company manage a critical piece of public infrastructure for decades, inspect itself, ignore its own internal warnings, and allow a structure to disintegrate while reporting it safe, if the regulatory system, the inspection process, and the government oversight were functioning as designed? That is exactly what we are going to find out. The Morandi Bridge was opened to traffic in 1967. It carried the A10 motorway across the Polcevera River Valley in northwest Genoa, connecting the port city to the rest of Italy and southern France. The bridge was named after its designer, Riccardo Morandi, a celebrated Italian civil engineer known for using pre-stressed concrete and unconventional structural forms. The design was distinctive. 3 main towers, each shaped like an inverted Y, supported the deck using inclined cable stays. The cables themselves were made of steel strands, encased inside hollow concrete sleeves. The sleeves were supposed to protect the steel from corrosion. In practice, they did the opposite. Concrete is porous. Moisture seeped inside the sleeves and became trapped. The steel corroded in an environment it could not be inspected. The design created a hidden failure point. Morandi himself understood this. In 1979, he published a paper warning that bridges of this type required continuous and costly maintenance because the stay cables were vulnerable to a chemical process called carbonation. Carbonation occurs when carbon dioxide from the air penetrates concrete and reacts with moisture to form carbonic acid. The acid lowers the pH of the concrete, which destroys the protective alkaline layer around embedded steel. Once that layer is gone, the steel begins to rust. The rust expands. The expansion cracks the concrete. The cracks allow more moisture in. The cycle accelerates. Morandi knew this. He described it in technical journals. He warned the operators. The bridge was never built to be maintenance-free. It was built to require constant surveillance. For decades, it did not receive it. In 1999, the Italian government privatized most of its national motorway network. The A10, including the Morandi Bridge, was transferred to a private concessionaire called Autostrade per l'Italia. Autostrade was majority owned by Atlantia, a holding company controlled by the Benetton family. The privatization contract required Autostrade to maintain the infrastructure and conduct regular safety inspections. In exchange, the company collected tolls from drivers and retained the revenue. The government was supposed to oversee the arrangement through the Ministry of Infrastructure and Transport. But the ministry lacked the technical staff and resources to verify the company's reports independently. It relied on documentation provided by Autostrade itself. And Autostrade, in turn, hired its own subsidiary, an engineering consultancy called SPIA, to carry out the inspections. The firm inspecting the bridge was owned by the company operating it. The regulator was the regulated. Stop right here, because this is where the structural explanation breaks. A safety inspection is supposed to be an independent audit. It is supposed to function as an adversarial check. The inspector is meant to have no financial interest in the outcome, no incentive to minimize risk, no reason to avoid recommending expensive repairs. But when the company paying for the repairs also employs the inspector, the incentive structure inverts. Every serious defect identified becomes a cost to the parent company. Every repair mandate reduces profit. Every shutdown interrupts toll revenue. The inspection becomes a performance review of the infrastructure, judged by the same entity that profits from keeping it operational. What the prosecutors found, years later, was that this conflict was not theoretical. It was operational. SPEA inspectors submitted reports year after year, declaring the bridge safe for continued use. The reports were often copy-pasted from previous years with updated dates. Identical wording, identical conclusions, identical risk assessments. When inspectors did document visible damage, the reports allegedly described it in vague, non-urgent language. Cracks were called surface imperfections. Exposed rebar was noted without alarm. Rust stains were mentioned without follow-up. In some cases, according to court filings, photographs of structural damage were digitally altered before being included in official reports. Cracks were erased. Discoloration was removed. The images were edited to make the bridge appear safer than it was. And the edited versions were submitted to the ministry as proof of compliance. Meanwhile, the bridge was deteriorating in real time. The concrete sleeves around the stay cables were crumbling. Chunks of concrete were falling onto the roadway below. Drivers reported seeing pieces of the structure on the deck. Maintenance crews were dispatched to clean up debris, but the underlying cause was never addressed. The cables were rotting from the inside. By 2012, the corrosion had progressed far enough that Autostrade's own internal engineering team produced a risk assessment. The document was not intended for public release. It was a confidential report for senior management. The report stated clearly that the bridge's stay cables were at risk of sudden failure. It warned that the structure could collapse within 5 to 10 years if no intervention was taken. It recommended an immediate and expensive retrofit involving the replacement or reinforcement of the cable systems. The path reports taken on all 3 towers. The estimated cost was 20 million euros. The report was circulated internally. Then it was filed. No retrofit was ordered. No emergency repair was launched. No public announcement was made. The bridge remained open to traffic. Tolls continued to be collected. Dividends continued to be paid to shareholders. And the clock started. The 2012 report had predicted failure within a decade. By 2018, 6 years had passed. On the morning of August 14th, the weather in Genoa was stormy. Heavy rain and high wind. The bridge deck was slick. Traffic was moderate. Just before 11:43 a.m., a heavy truck carrying a steel coil weighing 44 tons began crossing the easternmost span. The truck was approaching Tower 9, the support pillar on the eastern side of the valley. Tower 9 had not been reinforced in the 1990s. It was the only one of the 3 main towers left in its original condition. The stay cables supporting that tower had been corroding for decades. Moisture had entered the concrete sleeves. Carbonation had destroyed the alkaline protection. Rust had consumed the steel strands from the inside. By 2018, forensic engineers later determined, some of the cables had lost 20% of their load-bearing capacity. The steel strands were pitted, thinned, brittle. At 11:43, under the combined load of the truck, the rain-soaked deck, and the wind-induced oscillation, one of the eastern stay cables snapped. The tower lost its primary support. The deck began to sag. Other cables, already weakened, took the sudden redistribution of weight. They snapped in sequence. The entire eastern span detached from Tower 9 and fell. 210 meters of motorway, 4 lanes wide, concrete, steel, asphalt, vehicles. It dropped 45 meters in less than 3 seconds. The impact destroyed a section of railway line beneath the bridge. It crushed warehouses. It flattened homes. A delivery truck braked just meters from the edge of the collapse and stopped. The photograph of that truck, tires at the brink, became the global image of the disaster. Behind it, the bridge was gone. 43 people were killed. Families driving to the coast for the Ferragosto holiday. Workers in the warehouses below. Residents in nearby apartment blocks. The bodies were not all recovered immediately. Some were buried under rubble. Some were found in vehicles at the base of the debris field. The collapse was broadcast live. A security camera on a nearby building recorded the moment of failure. The footage shows the deck dropping vertically, then disintegrating into a cloud of dust and steel. The sound is described by witnesses as a prolonged roar followed by silence. 600 people living in buildings near the remaining bridge sections were evacuated and never allowed to return. Their homes were later demolished as part of the safety cordon. The remaining portions of the bridge were dismantled over the following months. What the forensic investigation revealed in the weeks after the collapse was that the failure had been entirely predictable. The steel cables showed advanced corrosion. The concrete sleeves were fractured and water-saturated. The internal strands had rusted to the point of structural inadequacy. The evidence was physical, measurable, and undeniable. And it had been visible, or at least detectable, for years. Investigators found the 2012 report. They found earlier maintenance logs describing cable degradation. They found correspondence between engineers and management recommending urgent intervention. They found financial records showing that repair budgets had been reduced or deferred multiple times to preserve profit margins. They found performance bonuses awarded to managers who kept costs low. They found evidence that monitoring sensors installed to detect dangerous cable vibrations had been tampered with or disabled. And they found testimony from engineers who said they had raised alarms internally and been ignored, reassigned, or pressured to soften their language. One engineer reportedly told investigators that he had been demoted after insisting that the bridge required immediate attention. His warnings were documented. His concerns were filed. His recommendations were not implemented. What nobody notices yet is that this was not the first time a Morandi-designed bridge had failed. In 1964, a bridge in Maracaibo, Venezuela, built using the same stay cable and concrete sleeve system, suffered a partial collapse during construction. The failure was attributed to corrosion of the internal cables. Morandi himself had studied the incident and updated his maintenance guidelines as a result. The lesson was documented. The risk was known. The Italian bridge was never upgraded to reflect it. The investigation expanded. Prosecutors opened a criminal case. 59 individuals were charged, including top executives at Autostrade and Atlantia, senior managers at SPEA, engineers who had signed off on false reports, and officials at the Ministry of Infrastructure who had failed to enforce oversight. The lead prosecutor described the collapse not as a tragedy, but as a crime, a preventable disaster caused by deliberate negligence, financial prioritization over public safety, and systemic regulatory failure. In court filings, prosecutors alleged that the defendants were aware of the risk of imminent collapse, but chose not to finance the necessary repairs in order to preserve shareholder dividends and avoid disrupting toll revenue. The evidence included internal emails, board meeting minutes, and financial statements showing that repair proposals had been rejected on cost grounds. Autostrada and Atlantia denied criminal responsibility. They argued that the collapse was due to unforeseen structural degradation and that all required inspections had been completed according to regulatory standards. But the regulatory standards, investigators found, were largely self-defined. Autostrada had written its own maintenance protocols. SPEA had conducted inspections under those protocols. The ministry had accepted the results without independent verification. The system had no adversarial check, no external auditor, no enforced accountability. It was a closed loop. The Benetton family, who controlled Atlantia, waited 2 days after the collapse to issue a public statement. When they did, the statement expressed condolences but avoided accepting responsibility. The delay was widely criticized. Victims' families accused the family of prioritizing legal strategy over human decency. When the Italian government organized a state funeral for the victims, many families refused to attend. They boycotted the ceremony in protest of what they described as governmental complicity in the disaster. They argued that the state had privatized the infrastructure, outsourced the oversight, and failed to protect the public. The funeral proceeded with empty chairs, representing the families who stayed away. The political fallout was immediate. The Italian government threatened to revoke Autostrade's concession and renationalize the motorway network. The company's stock price collapsed. Atlantia faced billions in potential liabilities. Public anger was sustained and widespread. In 2020, under mounting pressure, the Benetton family agreed to sell its controlling stake in Autostrade. The government reclaimed partial control of the motorway system. The sale was described as a forced exit. But here's the thing. The financial restructuring, the management changes, the political reckoning, all of it focused on the failure of the private model, on the conflict of interest, on the self-regulation, on the profit motive overriding safety. What it did not address was the deeper structural question. Why was a bridge that required constant, expensive, technically sophisticated maintenance ever privatized in the first place? Morandi himself had warned that this design demanded perpetual vigilance. The concrete sleeves could not be inspected visually. The steel could not be replaced without dismantling the structure. The corrosion process was invisible until it reached the point of failure. The bridge was not suitable for a low-cost, profit-maximizing operational model. It required the opposite: high investment, frequent intervention, conservative risk margins, institutional memory. It required an operator with no financial incentive to delay repairs. The privatization model introduced exactly that incentive, and the regulatory model failed to counteract it. The result was not an accident. It was the system operating as designed. A bridge that needed continuous care was handed to a company that profited from deferring it. The company hired itself to inspect itself. The government accepted the outcome. The bridge fell. And this is where the explanation breaks. Because if the system failed in Genoa, it is failing elsewhere. Italy's motorway network includes hundreds of aging structures built in the 1960s and 70s. Many use similar materials, similar designs, similar maintenance requirements. Most are operated under similar concession agreements by private firms. The same incentive structure applies, the same self-inspection model, the same regulatory gaps. After the Morandi collapse, the government ordered inspections of other high-risk bridges. Dozens were found to have serious structural defects. Some were closed immediately. Others were reinforced. But the inspection process revealed that many had been operating for years with hidden damage that had never been reported. The Morandi disaster was not an isolated failure. It was a visible rupture in a system that had been quietly deteriorating across the entire network. What prosecutors called a crime was also a preview, a demonstration of what happens when infrastructure built for the public is operated for profit, inspected by the same entity that profits from its continued use, and regulated by a government that lacks the capacity or will to enforce accountability. The bridge that fell in Genoa is gone. A new structure, designed by Renzo Piano, was completed in just 15 months and opened in 2020. It is a clean, modern design. Cable stayed, like the original, but with external cables that can be inspected and replaced. It was built as a symbol of resilience, of rebuilding, of moving forward. but it does not answer the question. The 43 people who died did not die because the technology failed. They died because the system was designed to prioritize profit over maintenance, self-interest over safety, and dividends over the physical integrity of a structure that thousands of people crossed every day. The 2012 report sits in the court record now. The warning that was never acted on. The prediction that came true. The document that proves the collapse was not a surprise. It was a countdown. And the people in charge let the clock run out. The bridge collapsed in year 6 of a 10-year warning window. The steel had rusted 20% beyond safe limits. The cables had been rotting inside their concrete shells for decades. The sensors had been disabled. The reports had been copied and pasted. The inspectors had been paid by the company they were supposed to regulate. The government had privatized the risk and outsourced the responsibility. And when the structure finally gave way, it took less than 10 seconds. The explanation does not survive the numbers. The official version asks you to believe this was a failure of foresight. The forensic record shows it was a choice, a financial decision that traded 43 lives for operational cost savings and shareholder returns. What nobody wants to say is that the same trade is being made right now on other bridges, in other cities, under other concession agreements, wherever the profit motive is allowed to regulate itself. The Morandi Bridge is not a cautionary tale. It is a working model, and the model is still running.